The moment I opened that file, I understood everything. Not just about my sister. About every dinner where I sat quietly. Every family gathering where I smiled and said nothing. Every time I heard my name attached to a lie and chose not to fight back. It all made sense now. Rochelle Fontaine, mortgage application, $500,000, Buckhead Townhouse. My sister had walked into my bank without knowing I worked there. She had handed over documents she thought no one would question. And by some collision of fate and irony that I could not have scripted myself, her file landed on my desk. I'm Aaliyah Fontaine. I'm 31 years old. I'm a senior loan officer at First Horizon Bank in Midtown Atlanta. And for the past 8 years, my sister had been telling everyone who would listen that I was drowning in debt, couldn't manage money, barely making rent, her words, spoken at Sunday dinners, at cookouts, at Thanksgiving, loud enough to stick quiet enough to seem like concern. What was in that file told a completely different story. Not about me, about her. But before I show you what I found, I need to take you back. Because you can't understand that moment sitting at my desk reading those numbers unless you understand what came before it, unless you understand what it costs to be the quiet one in a family that mistakes silence for weakness. If this story is already pulling you in, hit that like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely want to be here. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever had someone spread lies about you to the people you love most? I want to know. Now let me take you back to the beginning. The house on Westview Drive was the kind of house that looked like a good life from the outside. 3 bedrooms, a covered porch with hanging ferns, a driveway that my father Curtis swept every Saturday morning without fail, the kind of neighborhood in West End Atlanta where people knew each other's names, where somebody's grandmother was always sitting on the porch, where the smell of somebody's kitchen followed you down the block on Sunday afternoons. From the outside, we were a solid family. Curtis Fontaine, civil engineer, steady job, quiet man who said grace before every meal and meant it. Yvonne Fontaine, school district coordinator, church choir, alto, the kind of woman who brought casseroles to grieving families and remembered every birthday in the extended family. 2 daughters, a paid-off car in the driveway, a savings account, a Christmas tree that went up the Friday after Thanksgiving without exception. From the outside, we were doing just fine. From the inside, there were 2 daughters, but there was only one who mattered. Her name was Rochelle. Rochelle was 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand what attention looked like, I understood that it moved in her direction. Not occasionally. Not in the way that oldest children sometimes get more responsibility or more privilege. Constantly. Completely, like gravity. Rochelle was the kind of girl people noticed. Tall, loud in the best way, the one who walked into a room and made it louder just by being there. She had our mother's energy and our father's cheekbones and a laugh that made adults forget they were supposed to be in charge. She was magnetic. I understood that even as a child. I didn't resent it then. I just didn't understand yet what it was going to cost me. I was the quiet one, the reader, the one who stayed at the table after dinner doing homework while Rochelle was already on the phone, already making plans already somewhere else. I made straight A's in a household that treated grades the way most households treat utility bills, necessary, expected, unremarkable. Rochelle made B's and C's and sometimes worse. Every report card was an event, a conversation, a negotiation. She's just not a school person, our mother Yvonne would say. She has other gifts. I was a school person. Apparently, that wasn't a gift. The first time I understood clearly that the rules were different for each of us, I was 14 years old. Rochelle had just turned 18. She was graduating high school with a 2.3 GPA and a lot of plans she hadn't quite figured out yet. Our parents threw her a graduation party that took 3 weeks to plan. They rented the fellowship hall at Greater Faith Baptist. They hired a caterer, Miss Carolyn's The Soul Food Place on Cascade Road that people booked months in advance. They ordered a custom cake, 3 tiers, Rochelle's senior photo printed on top in edible ink. 45 guests, a DJ, streamers in her school colors. I stood in the corner of that fellowship hall in a dress Yvonne had bought me specifically to look nice in the background of Rochelle's photos. I smiled when someone pointed a camera in our direction. I ate a piece of that cake. I told Rochelle congratulations, and I meant it. 2 years later, I graduated valedictorian. 4.0 GPA. Full academic scholarship to Georgia State University. The first person in our immediate family to earn a full ride. My graduation celebration was dinner at the house. The 4 of us. Yvonne made her baked chicken and mac and cheese, which I loved, so I told myself it was fine. Curtis said he was proud of me. He meant it. But he said it quietly, the way he said most things, and then he turned on the game. There was no cake with my photo on top. There was no DJ. There were no 45 guests. There was a card from Yvonne that said, "We're so proud of you, baby," in her handwriting, and a $25 gift card to Barnes & Noble tucked inside. The same month, Yvonne bought Rochelle a MacBook Pro $1,700 because Rochelle had mentioned she wanted to start a blog. The blog lasted 6 weeks. I carried that Barnes & Noble gift card in my wallet for almost a year, not because I was saving it, because every time I looked at it, something in me refused to throw it away, like it was evidence of something I hadn't yet figured out how to name. Rochelle noticed that I'd gone quiet about it. That was the first time she did what she would spend the next decade perfecting. She made it about my attitude. "You're always so sensitive," she said one afternoon when just the two of us were in the kitchen. "Nobody meant anything by it. You act like everything is a competition." I wasn't competing. I had already won by every measurable standard they claimed to value. That was exactly the problem. My winning didn't fit the story they'd already written. I washed the dishes and said nothing. That was a pattern I would repeat for years. Wash the dishes, say nothing, make myself smaller, tell myself it didn't matter. I almost believe it. What I didn't see then, what I couldn't see yet, was that Rochelle was watching me go quiet and learning something from it. She was learning that silence was permission, that I would absorb whatever she said and not push back, that she could shape the story of who I was slowly, steadily in rooms I wasn't in, and I would never call her a liar to her face. She wasn't wrong about that. Not then. Our Aunt Phyllis, our father's younger sister, the sharpest woman I have ever known, pulled me aside at a family cookout that summer. I was 19. She pressed a glass of lemonade into my hand and looked at me with those eyes that never missed anything. "You see what's happening, don't you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "I see it," I said. "Good." She squeezed my hand once. "Then keep your eyes open and your mouth closed for now. You're building something. Don't let them see it until it's done." I didn't fully understand what she meant. I was 19, heading into my freshman year on a full scholarship, trying to figure out who I was outside of that house on Westview Drive. But I held on to her words, and I started building. I didn't know it then, but Aunt Phyllis had just handed me the blueprint for the next 12 years of my life, and Rochelle had just started laying the groundwork for the worst mistake she would ever make. Georgia State's scholarship covered tuition, housing, and a modest stipend for books. It did not cover everything else. The laptop I needed for my finance coursework, the professional clothes for the internship interviews that started sophomore year, the cost of eating something other than ramen 4 nights a week. Small things that added up fast when you were doing it completely alone. I called home once during the first semester of freshman year to ask if there was any help available, not a large amount, $400. Enough to cover the laptop and get through the semester without selling back every textbook I owned. Curtis answered, "We don't really have extra right now," he said. There was a pause, a familiar pause, the kind that meant he was looking across the room at Yvonne for confirmation of something he'd already decided. "You've got your scholarship, you're smart, you'll figure it out." I said, "Okay." I thanked him. I hung up. That same month, I found out later, Yvonne wired Rochelle $3,000 for her first semester at a private arts college in Savannah. Full tuition. Rochelle lasted 1 academic year before she withdrew. The reason, according to Yvonne at the time, it just wasn't the right environment for her creativity. $3,000. Gone. $400. Too much. I got the laptop by picking up a weekend shift at the campus library reference desk, $12 an hour, every Saturday and Sunday for 2 months. I bought it secondhand from a graduate student who was upgrading. It had a crack in the lower left corner of the screen that I taped over with a piece of black electrical tape. I used that laptop for 3 years. I never told my parents any of this, not because I wanted to protect them, because I already understood at 19 years old that telling them would not produce help. It would produce a conversation about why I was making things harder than they needed to be. So I worked. I studied. I kept my grades at 4.0 through sophomore year, junior year, senior year. I graduated magna cum laude with a degree in finance and a minor in economics. I had already accepted a junior loan officer position at First Horizon Bank before commencement. The graduation ceremony was held at Georgia State's Convocation Center in May. It seated 3,000 people. My family took up 4 seats, Curtis, Yvonne, Rochelle, and Aunt Phyllis. Curtis wore his good suit. He sat up straight and clapped when my name was called. Yvonne cried a little, which surprised me. Aunt Phyllis stood up, the only person in our section who stood and put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled the way she'd done at every important moment in my life since I was 7 years old. Rochelle sat with her phone in her lap the entire ceremony. When we took photos afterward in the courtyard, she positioned herself next to me and smiled beautifully for the camera, and later that night, she posted one of those photos on her Instagram with a caption that said, "So proud of my little sis," with a red heart emoji. 46 people liked it. 3 people commented saying how sweet she was. She had been on her phone through my entire ceremony. She left before the dinner we'd planned because she had something she needed to handle. There was no gift, no card. Just the Instagram post, which was really a gift to herself, a piece of public record that said she was a good sister without requiring her to actually be one. I saved that post, not out of sentimentality, out of habit. I had started keeping records of things without quite knowing why. The lying started small. Rochelle had moved back to Atlanta by the time I started at First Horizon. She was 27, living in a one-bedroom apartment in East Atlanta that our parents helped subsidize, building what she called her personal brand. She posted lifestyle content brunches, travel fashion, what she called bougie on a budget content that her growing following seemed to enjoy. The following was real, the budget part was not. I learned this gradually, the way you learn most uncomfortable truths about people you love, not in one conversation, but in accumulating details that you try to explain away until you can't anymore. The first detail was a comment Rochelle made at Sunday dinner about 6 months after I started working. Yvonne had mentioned casually and with evident pride that I was doing well at the bank. Rochelle looked up from her plate. "Working at a bank doesn't make you rich, Aaliyah. You know that, right? You're basically just a teller with a college degree." Curtis kept eating. Yvonne made a sound that was almost a laugh, the kind of sound that lands between amusement and agreement. Nobody corrected Rochelle. Nobody said that I was not in fact a teller, that I was in a junior analyst position with a clear advancement track and a starting salary of $42,000, which was $42,000 more than Rochelle had made that year from her brand partnerships. I looked at my food. I said nothing. That was the first comment. There would be many more. The second detail came from Aunt Phyllis, who called me on a Tuesday evening about 4 months later. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice had that particular stillness that meant she'd thought carefully about whether to say it at all. "Rochelle told your cousin Deshawn that you've been struggling to pay your rent, that you borrowed money from your mother and haven't paid it back." I sat down on the edge of my bed. "I never borrowed money from Mama," I said. "I know that. I've never asked them for money since freshman year. I know that too." There was a silence between us, the kind that didn't need to be filled. Why would she say that? I asked, though part of me already knew. Not the specific reason, the general one. Rochelle needed a version of me that made sense alongside her version of herself. A successful younger sister with a finance degree and a real job and a $0 debt balance disrupted the narrative. A struggling younger sister who couldn't manage her own money that fit much better. "Baby," Aunt Phyllis said carefully, "some people can't stand next to your light, so they try to dim it before anybody else sees it." I didn't say anything for a moment. "Does she know I know?" I asked. "No." "Good," I said. "Let's keep it that way." That night, I opened a spreadsheet on my cracked laptop. I still hadn't replaced it, and I started a document. Not of grievances, of facts, dates, amounts, conversations, things that were said and where and in front of whom. I didn't know exactly what I was building. I just knew that the truth had a way of getting buried in families like mine, and I wanted mine somewhere it couldn't be touched. I saved the file under a name that meant nothing to anyone but me. I closed the laptop. I went to sleep. And in the morning, I went back to work, to the job Rochelle had called glorified teller work, and I did what I always did. I showed up, I studied, I kept my mouth closed and my eyes open the way Aunt Phyllis had taught me. Nobody was watching. That was exactly how I needed it. Because the worst part wasn't that Rochelle was lying about me. The worst part was how easily everyone believed her, and that told me something about my family that I was only beginning to understand. The promotion came on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. My manager called me into his office at 4:15, offered me a seat, slid a folder across the desk, and told me that effective the 1st of next month, I would be moving into a senior loan officer role. New title, new responsibilities, new salary, $85,000 base, plus performance bonus. I shook his hand. I walked back to my desk. I sat down, opened my computer, and went back to work. I did not call my parents. I had learned by then that good news shared with certain people doesn't stay good for long. It gets handled, turned over, examined for flaws. Rochelle had a particular talent for finding the angle on any achievement of mine that made it sound smaller than it was. And Yvonne had a particular talent for nodding along. So I kept the promotion quiet for 3 weeks, told only Aunt Phyllis and my colleague Kendrick, who brought me a cupcake from the place on Peachtree Street, and left it on my desk without making a production of it. That was the kind of celebration I had learned to appreciate. Small, real, no performance required. No, what I did with that new salary was nobody's business but mine. I had been saving aggressively since my first paycheck at 23 years old, not because anyone taught me to, but because I had grown up watching what happened when money was handled carelessly. I had watched Rochelle spend everything she made, and then some. I had watched my parents subsidize her lifestyle without appearing to notice the pattern. I had decided very early that I was going to do the opposite of everything I'd grown up seeing. By the time the promotion came through, I had been quietly educating myself for 2 years. Not in the way my finance degree had educated me formally, theoretically, in a specific, practical, deliberately unglamorous way. I joined an online community of Black real estate investors, mostly women, mostly from the South, who shared resources and property listings and hard-won knowledge about what the wealth-building process actually looked like from the ground up. I read every book I could find on the subject. I ran numbers on properties the way other people my age were running numbers on vacation budgets. At 26, I bought my first property, a 3-bedroom house in East Point, 12 miles southwest of Midtown. It needed work, the kitchen was dated, 1 bathroom needed a full renovation, the backyard was overgrown. I spent 8 months and $14,000 of my own savings on repairs, doing what I could myself, on weekends, hiring contractors for the rest. When the renovations were done, I listed it as a rental. It was occupied within 3 weeks. Monthly rental income, $1,800. Monthly mortgage payment, $940. I sat with the first rent check in my hands for a long moment. It was just paper, a number, but it represented something that felt almost physical, a door I had walked through that I couldn't walk back out of. I was at 26 years old, a landlord, a property owner, someone whose name was on a deed. Nobody in my immediate family knew. Aunt Phyllis knew. She had been the one to first mention real estate to me years earlier in that quiet way she had of planting seeds without making a show of it. When I called her to tell her about the East Point house, she was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Tell me the numbers." I told her the numbers. Another silence, then, "Baby, you did that right?" Coming from Aunt Phyllis, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. We had dinner together the following Sunday at Pascal's on Northside Drive, the restaurant that had been feeding Atlanta's Black community since the civil rights era, the kind of place that felt like history and home in the same breath. Over catfish and cornbread, Aunt Phyllis talked to me about the next steps, about thinking in terms of portfolios, not just properties, about what it meant to build wealth that compounded quietly and visibly in ways that most people would never see coming. Your grandmother used to say, she told me, stirring her sweet tea slowly, that the people who need to announce what they have don't have as much as they want you to think. And the people who never say a word, she paused, smiled, those are the ones you need to pay attention to. I thought about Rochelle's Instagram, the curated brunches, the travel content, the carefully staged photos of a life that looked expensive and effortless. I thought about my own accounts, my deed, my spreadsheet of quiet growing numbers. I understood exactly what Aunt Phyllis was telling me. By 29, I had purchased 2 more properties, a duplex in Reynoldstown and a single-family home in College Park, both cash flow positive within the first quarter. Combined with my salary and bonus at First Horizon, my annual income had crossed into territory that would have seemed impossible to the girl who taped over a crack in her secondhand laptop. My total portfolio value conservatively estimated $800,000. My family still thought I was barely keeping up with rent. Rochelle had made sure of that. The Thanksgiving incident was not the first time she had spoken about me that way, but it was the most public, and it was the one that finally cracked something open inside me. It happened at the table. 25 people. Family and close friends, the kind of gathering that felt from the outside like abundance and warmth. Curtis had smoked a turkey. Yvonne had made her famous sweet potato pie. The table was loud and full the way it always was when the Fontaine family gathered in numbers. I was passing the green beans to my cousin Deshawn when I heard it. Rochelle was talking to Aunt Patricia at the other end of the table. Her voice was not quite loud enough to address the room, but not quite quiet enough to be private. That was a technique I had come to recognize, pitched precisely to be overheard by the people she wanted to reach. "I just worry about her, that's all," Rochelle was saying. She had her concerned sister expression on the one she deployed like a costume. "She's not great with money, never has been. I've seen her statements. The credit card situation is, it's not good. I wouldn't go to Aaliyah for financial advice. I love her, but..." A small, practiced sigh. "I just hope she figures it out." Aunt Patricia's eyes drifted toward me. So did Deshawn's. So did the eyes of 2 of my parents' friends, whose names I had known since childhood. Yvonne, seated 3 chairs from Rochelle, said nothing. Curtis was watching the game on the television mounted in the corner of the dining room. He hadn't heard, or he had decided not to. I picked up my fork. I took a sip of water. My hand was steady. My face was steady. Years of practice had made me very good at steady. But something had changed. Something that I would not be able to name clearly until 3 months later, sitting at my desk on a Tuesday morning, staring at a mortgage application with my sister's name on it. I set my fork down. I looked across the table at Rochelle, who had moved on, was laughing now at something someone else had said, had already filed this particular performance away. and was on to the next one, and I made a decision so quiet it barely felt like a decision at all. I was done being the version of me that she had invented. Not loudly, not dramatically, not at that table, not that night, but I was done. What I didn't know yet was that the universe was already arranging the circumstances that would make done mean something real, something documented, something that would sit on my desk in a manila folder on a Tuesday morning 3 months later and say everything I had been too disciplined to say out loud. Aunt Phyllis had told me that quiet money doesn't make noise until it's ready. It was almost ready. January in Atlanta is deceptive. It looks mild from the outside. No blizzards, no frozen pipes, none of the dramatic winter that other cities wear like a badge. But there's a cold that settles into the city in January that doesn't announce itself. It gets into your bones slowly. You don't notice it until you're already chilled through. That January felt like that. 3 months had passed since Thanksgiving. I had not been back to the house on Westview Drive. I had not attended the Christmas gathering, a first in my 31 years. I told Curtis I had obligations with friends. He said okay in the way he said most things, without pressing, without asking what had changed. Yvonne sent a text on Christmas morning that said, "Merry Christmas, baby, we miss you," followed by a photo of the decorated tree. Rochelle sent nothing. I spent Christmas at Aunt Phyllis's house in Decatur, and it was the most peaceful holiday I had experienced in years. We ate too much, watched old movies, and sat on her back porch in the cold with blankets and hot tea, and talked about everything except the family dynamics that had brought me to her doorstep. She didn't ask. She knew. That was the thing about Aunt Phyllis. She understood that sometimes people needed to be somewhere safe before they could even begin to name what they were running from. I drove home on December 26th, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Rested. The call from Yvonne came on a Sunday evening in the second week of January. I was at home going over financials for a duplex listing I was considering in Kirkwood when my phone lit up on the kitchen counter. I looked at it for 3 full seconds before I answered. "Hey, Mama." "Aaliyah." Her voice had that particular texture, careful measured the way she sounded when she had rehearsed what she was going to say. "I need to talk to you about something. Can you come to Sunday dinner next week? Your father and I think we should all sit down together." I set my pen down. "What's this about?" A pause, slightly too long. "We've just been hearing some things, and we want to make sure you're okay, as a family." "What kind of things?" Another pause. "Just things. About your finances. We're not trying to pry. We just want to help if you need it before—" She stopped, recalibrated. "Before things get worse." I knew exactly where those things had come from. There was only one person in our family who trafficked in things about my finances. Only one person who had made it her ongoing project to construct a version of my life that served her purposes. "I'm fine, Mama," I said. My voice was even. "I've always been fine. I know you say that. I'm not saying it. I'm telling you." A beat. "But I'll come to dinner next Sunday." I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of my kitchen. Through the window, the Atlanta skyline was visible in the distance, lit up against the dark January sky. Somewhere out there, in an apartment in East Atlanta that her parents were quietly subsidizing, my sister had made another phone call, had said more things, had wound another thread around another person's perception of who I was. I picked my pen back up and went back to my numbers. The following Sunday arrived gray and cold. I drove to Westview Drive in silence, no music, just the sound of the city moving around me. I had dressed carefully, not to impress. I never dressed to impress at that house, but to feel like myself. Dark slacks, a camel coat I had bought from a boutique on Ponce de Leon Avenue the previous fall. Simple jewelry. I wanted to walk into that room feeling like the person I had built myself into, not the person they had decided I was. Curtis opened the door. He hugged me with the particular stiffness he always had. Not cold exactly, just economical, as though affection were a resource to be rationed. "Good to see you," he said, and he meant it in his way. The house smelled like Vaughn's pot roast, the way it always did on Sundays. The television was on in the den. Everything looked exactly as it always had. The family photos on the hallway wall, the same arrangement of furniture that had been in the same positions for 20 years, the ceramic bowl on the entry table where Curtis kept his keys and his pocket change. Rochelle was already there. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of sweet tea, scrolling her phone, dressed in the kind of effortlessly expensive-looking outfit that was her uniform, though I now knew, with professional certainty, exactly how that particular kind of effortless was funded. She looked up when I walked in. "Hey, sis." Warm smile, easy tone, as if Thanksgiving had never happened, as if she had not stood 3 months ago at a table full of people we had known our whole lives and performed concern about my finances like a woman who had rehearsed in the mirror. "Rochelle," I said. That was all. We sat down to dinner. Curtis said grace. Yvonne served the pot roast with her good china, the kind reserved for significant occasions, which told me this conversation had been given more weight than a casual check-in. The four of us settled into the familiar rhythms of a Fontaine Sunday dinner food passed around the table, small talk about the neighborhood, questions about Curtis's latest project at work. Then Yvonne set her fork down. Aaliyah! She folded her hands on the table the way she did when she had something prepared. We've been worried about you. We've been hearing... She glanced briefly at Rochelle, just briefly, but I caught it. We've been hearing that you've been having a hard time, financially. I looked at my mother steadily. Where did you hear that? It doesn't matter where, it does to me. Yvonne's jaw tightened slightly. We're not here to point fingers. We just want to know if you need help. Because if you're behind on things, if there are bills you can't cover, we want to know now, before it becomes something bigger. The table was very quiet. Curtis was looking at his plate. Rochelle was looking at me with an expression of practiced innocence, so refined it was almost impressive eyebrows. Slightly raised head tilted just a degree, the picture of a concerned older sister who had only ever wanted the best for her troubled younger sibling. I looked at her for a moment, then I looked back at my mother. I want to ask you something directly, I said. My voice was calm. I had spent years developing this calm. Have you ever asked Rochelle about her finances? Silence. Have you ever sat her down at this table with the good china and asked her to account for herself? I continued. Because I'm curious what that conversation would look like. Yvonne's expression shifted. Something between discomfort and warning. This isn't about Rochelle. No, I agreed. It never is. Rochelle made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. See, this is what I mean, she said quietly to no one in particular. I try to help, and she makes it into an attack. Curtis set his fork down then. Not loudly, deliberately. The way he signaled that he was about to weigh in, which was rare enough that everyone at the table noticed. Aaliyah, he said, nobody's attacking you, we're just concerned. I looked at my father, at the man who had told me to figure it out when I needed $400 for a laptop, at the man who had written checks for Rochelle's failed college experiment without a second thought, at the man who was sitting at his own table in his good Sunday clothes, genuinely believing he was being a concerned father. He wasn't a bad man. That was the complicated part. He was just a man who had never looked closely enough to see what he was actually doing. I'm fine, Dad, I said. For the last time I would ever say those words in that house to mean something other than the truth. I've always been fine. I finished my dinner, I drove home, and when I pulled into the parking garage of the building I owned, sat in the car for a few quiet minutes, and finally reached for my phone. There was a text from Kendrick waiting. Hey, got a new application from a Fontaine on your desk Monday morning. Flagged it for review income docs, look off. I stared at the screen. I read it twice. Then I put the car in park, sat back, and looked at the ceiling of my car for a long moment. Monday was coming, and everything was about to change. I arrived at the office at 7:45 that Monday morning, 40 minutes before my usual time. The branch was still quiet, the overhead lights in their pre-opening setting, the front desk unmanned, the faint smell of the coffee that the overnight cleaning crew always left brewing as a courtesy. I signed in, badged through the interior door, and walked to my desk in the back corner of the loan processing floor, where I had sat for the past 4 years. The file was already there. Kendrick had left it centered on my keyboard, clipped shut, a yellow sticky note on the front in his handwriting, flag on income verification. Wanted you to see it first. I sat down. I took off my coat. I set my bag on the floor. I looked at the file for a moment without touching it the way you look at something when some part of you already knows that opening it is going to divide your life into a before and an after. Then I opened it. The application was for a conventional mortgage, $500,000. The property was a townhouse in Buckhead, a 3-story unit in a new development on Peachtree Road, the kind of address that carried a particular kind of weight in Atlanta. The kind of address you put on an application when you want the loan officer to see a life that matches the number. The applicant had listed her occupation as social media consultant and brand strategist, self-employed. I read through the first page slowly, then the second. By the third page, I had stopped reading at a normal pace. I was reading the way I read documents when something doesn't add up, methodically starting over, cross-referencing figures the way my training had taught me to. The income documentation was the first problem. Rochelle had submitted 2 years of tax returns showing annual gross income of $85,000 from her consulting work. The figure was specific enough to seem credible. Specific numbers always seem more credible than round ones. That was a thing I had learned in this job. People who fabricate income tend to make it precise because precision feels like proof. I pulled her supporting bank statements. The deposits did not match the returns. Not approximately, not within a margin of explanation. The actual documented income flowing through her accounts over the previous 24 months totaled $19,200. Annually, that was the real number, not $85,000. $19,200. I sat with that for a moment. $19,200 a year, that was what she had actually earned. That was the real Rochelle, not the one on Instagram with the curated flat lays and the sponsored brunch content and the confident captions about building an empire. The real one. The one behind the aesthetic. I kept reading. The asset documentation was the second problem. Significantly worse. Rochelle had listed savings and liquid assets of $40,000 across 2 accounts. The account statements she submitted told a different story. Combined balance across both accounts at the time of application, $812. $812. I set that page down on the desk in front of me. I picked it up again, read it again, put it down again. The credit report was the third problem and the most complete. Credit score, 562. Outstanding debt, $38,400 across 7 credit cards. 6 of the 7 were within 2% of their maximum limit. 1 had already been sent to collections. The monthly minimum payments alone on those 7 cards totaled over $900, a number that represented nearly half of what she actually brought home each month. I read through the list of creditors, the balances, the payment histories, the dates of the missed payments. The pattern was clear and consistent, someone who had been spending at a level disconnected from her income. For a long time, managing it month to month with minimum payments and new credit running the machine, on debt and presentation and the faith that something would eventually close the gap. Nothing had closed the gap. Instead, she had applied for a $500,000 mortgage. I sat at my desk for a long time after I finished reading. Not because I didn't know what to do next. I knew exactly what to do next. 8 years in this building had made the professional path absolutely clear. I was looking at a loan application that contained material misrepresentations on income assets and financial standing. The discrepancies weren't clerical errors. They weren't rounding differences or documentation oversights. They were deliberate. The numbers had been constructed carefully specifically to paint a picture of a borrower who did not exist. That was mortgage fraud. Not in a dramatic cinematic sense, in a federal, procedural, documented sense, the kind that had a specific process attached to it and specific consequences at the end of that process. I knew the process. I had been trained on it. I had applied it to other files, other applicants, other names I didn't recognize with the clean professionalism that the job required. This name I recognized. Kendrick appeared at the edge of my desk at 9:15. He set a coffee down without being ass black the way I took it. He leaned against the partition and looked at me with the expression of a person who had already read enough of the situation to know it was serious. "You okay?" he asked. "Working through it," I said. "The income discrepancy is significant." "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "You know this applicant?" I looked up at him. "She's my sister." Kendrick was still. The particular stillness of someone recalibrating everything they were about to say. "Oh, yeah, and what are you going to do?" I looked back at the file. At the pages laid out in front of me, the false returns, the empty accounts, the maxed out cards, the credit score that told the story of years of choices. At the name printed at the top of every page, Rochelle Fontaine, the woman who had stood at a Thanksgiving table in front of 25 people and told them I was drowning in debt. The woman who had called our cousin, our aunts, our family friends, and quietly, consistently, with her practiced, concerned sister voice, built a version of me that existed only to make her feel safer about the version of herself she was performing. What she had said about me, every word of it, was a precise, accurate description of her own financial life. Not mine. She had looked at herself and seen something she couldn't face, so she had put my name on it instead. I gathered the pages carefully, clipped them back together, placed the file in the center of my desk. "I'm going to do my job," I said. I documented the conflict of interest before 10 o'clock that morning. Standard protocol when a loan officer has a personal relationship with an applicant, the file is disclosed, recused, and escalated to a supervisor for independent review. It protects the applicant, it protects the institution, it protects the officer. I wrote the disclosure memo myself. Clear, factual 3 paragraphs. I noted the relationship sibling. I noted the material discrepancies I had observed before recusal. I noted that the file required full compliance review before any decision was rendered. I sent it to my supervisor. I copied the compliance department. Then I closed the file, pushed it to the corner of my desk, and went back to the rest of my work. That evening at 7:43, my phone rang. "Rochelle?" I looked at the screen for 2 rings. 3. I answered on the 4th. "Hey, sis!" Her voice was bright, casual, the way it always was when she wanted something and hadn't yet calculated that she might not get it. Small world, right? I applied for a mortgage at your bank. I was going to tell you, but I figured it would be a nice surprise. A nice surprise. I said nothing for a moment, let the silence sit. I can't help you with this, Rochelle, I said. My voice was quiet, steady. The same voice I had used at that Sunday dinner table. I've already recused myself per protocol. Someone else will handle your file. A short pause. Then the register of her voice shifted just slightly the way it did when a script wasn't landing the way she'd written it. Oh, come on, it's family. Can't you just... I can't do that, I said. It wouldn't be ethical. And I won't. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear her recalculating. Fine, she said finally. The warmth had drained out completely. Just one word, flat and final, the sound of a woman who had just realized the favor she had counted on was not coming. Fine. She hung up. I set my phone face down on the counter. I stood in my kitchen for a moment in the quiet. Outside, Atlanta moved through its evening traffic, distant music, the city going about its business the way it always did. I had not lied to her. I had not threatened her. I had not said a single word about what I had read in that file. I had simply done my job. And that it turned out was enough. Because what Rochelle didn't know, what she had never known through all the years of her careful practice performance, was that the truth doesn't require your help. It just requires the right desk. And it had found mine. Let me take you back before the file. Before the mortgage application, before Rochelle's phone call, and my supervisor's inbox, and the compliance department's quiet procedural machinery that was already beginning to turn. Let me take you back to where the real story was happening, the one nobody in my family could see because I had built it entirely out of their line of sight. It started the summer I was 23 years old, 6 weeks into my first job. My starting salary was $42,000 a year. In Atlanta in 2016, that was enough to live on if you were careful. I was more than careful. I was methodical in a way that probably would have alarmed most people my age if they had known about it. I rented a one-bedroom apartment in East Atlanta for $850 a month. Modest building, older appliances, the kind of place that required some patience and a good attitude about the occasional maintenance request. I furnished it mostly from estate sales and the Facebook marketplace, a real leather couch for $60 from a woman in Decatur who was moving to Seattle, a dining table that needed sanding, and a coat of stain that I applied myself on a Saturday afternoon with the windows open and music playing. I cooked at home. I brought my lunch to work. I drove a 2011 Honda Accord that I had paid cash for with money saved from 3 years of campus jobs. I did not have a car payment. I did not have student loans. The scholarship had taken care of that. I had one credit card with a $5,000 limit that I paid in full every single month without exception. My colleagues at First Horizon were mostly in their mid-20s, mostly buying things, new apartments, new cars, weekend trips, the accumulated lifestyle costs of young professionals in a city that made spending feel like participating. I liked my colleagues. I went to happy hours sometimes. I bought around occasionally, but I was building something they couldn't see. In the first year, I saved $22,000. I put it in a high-yield savings account and left it there untouched while I kept reading, kept studying, kept showing up to the online community of Black real estate investors that Aunt Phyllis had first pointed me toward, a group of women, mostly from Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana, who talked about property management and cap rates and tenant screening with the same energy that other groups talked about skincare routines and reality television. I was 24 when I made my first offer on a property. It fell through. I made a second offer. That one fell through too. The third offer, on a 3-bedroom in East Point that had been sitting on the market for 60 days because the previous buyers couldn't get financing, was accepted on a Wednesday morning in October. I remember sitting in my car outside the bank after signing the initial paperwork, hands on the steering wheel, engine off. Not celebrating, just sitting, feeling the weight of what I had just done, the responsibility of it, the realness of it, the fact that I had just made a decision that would compound in one direction or another for the rest of my life. And there was no one to consult, no one to ask, no safety net beneath me except the one I had built myself. I sat there for about 10 minutes. Then I drove home and made a list of every repair the property needed. The renovation took 8 months. I did not hire a general contractor to manage the process because I could not afford to lose the margin. I learned instead from YouTube, tutorials from the investors community, from a retired contractor named Mr. Elwood, who lived 2 streets over from the East Point property and took a liking to me after he saw me on a Saturday morning pulling up rotted porch boards with a crowbar and a focused expression. Mr. Elwood taught me how to assess structural integrity, how to read a subfloor, how to know when a wall was load-bearing and when it wasn't, how to talk to plumbers and electricians without getting taken advantage of. He never charged me for any of it. He just showed up some Saturdays with coffee and opinions, and I listened to every word. The kitchen renovation cost $4,000. The bathroom cost $3,200. New flooring throughout the main level, $2,800. Paint fixtures landscaping the new water heater that announced its failure on a Tuesday in February, another $4,400. Total renovation cost $14,400. I had budgeted for $15,000. I came in under. When the last contractor left and I walked through the finished property alone on a Sunday afternoon in June, I stood in the renovated kitchen for a long time. Clean white cabinets, new hardware, the late afternoon light coming through the window over the sink. A house that had been tired and overlooked when I found it and was now something someone would want to come home to. I had made that. With my own savings, my own weekends, my own research, and my own decisions, and my own hands on a crowbar at 7 in the morning on Saturdays when I could have been sleeping. Nobody had helped me. Nobody had co-signed. Nobody had written a check. I was 26 years old and I owned something real. The first tenant moved in 3 weeks after listing. A nurse named Tanya, 34 years old, recently relocated from Birmingham for a position at Grady Memorial Hospital. She signed a 12-month lease. She paid on time every month for the entire first year, and every month after that for the 3 years she stayed. Monthly rent $1,800. Monthly mortgage $940. Net cash flow before maintenance reserve $860 a month. $10,320 a year. Passive income. Money that arrived while I was sitting at my desk at First Horizon, processing other people's loan applications and building my own expertise in the same breath. I put every dollar of that cash flow back into a separate account I called the Acquisition Fund. The second property came at 29. A duplex in Reynoldstown, a neighborhood in the early stages of the kind of appreciation that people who pay attention to Atlanta real estate had been watching for 2 years. I paid $162,000 for it. Both units were occupied within 6 weeks of closing. Combined monthly rental income, $3,200. The third property came 4 months later. A single-family home in College Park close to the airport in a neighborhood that served a steady population of airline workers and Hartsfield-Jackson employees who needed clean, reliable housing near their job. Purchase price, $118,000. Monthly rent, $1,400. Occupied in 11 days, 3 properties. Combined estimated value by the time of Rochelle's mortgage application, $800,000. Combined monthly rental income, $6,400. Annual passive income from properties alone, $76,800. Added to my First Horizon salary and annual performance bonus, my total annual income had crossed $160,000 2 years before I ever opened Rochelle's file. I want you to hold that number for a moment. $160,000 a year. From the woman my sister had been telling everyone couldn't manage money. From the woman Yvonne had sat down with the good china to express concern about. From the woman whose credit card situation was reportedly not good according to Rochelle's Thanksgiving table performance. I had no credit card debt. I had never had credit card debt. I had a credit score of 814, a number that mortgage underwriters refer to without exaggeration as exceptional. I had 3 properties, a senior position at one of Atlanta's most respected financial institutions, a CFA credential I had earned over 3 years of evening study that I had never mentioned to my family because there was no version of that conversation that ended with them understanding what it meant, and a net worth that would have made Rochelle go pale if she had ever seen it. She hadn't. Nobody had. That had been the point. Aunt Phyllis had said it years ago over catfish and cornbread at Pascal's with the matter-of-fact certainty of a woman who had watched wealth work long enough to understand its patterns. Quiet money doesn't make noise until it's ready. I had been quiet for 8 years. I was almost ready. The letter from First Horizon's compliance department arrived at Rochelle's address on a Thursday. She called our mother before she called me. And that was when the noise started. Yvonne called me at 8:17 on a Friday morning. I was in the middle of my commute, sitting in the particular gridlock that connector traffic produces on Atlanta, mornings like a daily tax on everyone trying to get somewhere. My phone connected through the car speakers. Her name appeared on the dashboard screen. I looked at it for a moment at the road ahead, at the brake lights of the car in front of me glowing red in the gray morning light. I answered, "What did you do to your sister's application?" It was not a question. Her voice had the clipped, certain quality it took on when she had already decided the shape of a situation before calling to discuss it. "She said you blocked her on purpose. She said you used your position at that bank to go into her file and make sure she didn't get approved." I merged into the left lane, checked my mirror. "Good morning, Mama," I said. "Aaliyah, I am serious. Your sister is beside herself. She applied for that loan in good faith, and now she's getting letters from a compliance department. I recused myself from her file the same morning I received it, I said. That is standard protocol when a loan officer has a personal relationship with an applicant. I didn't review her application. I didn't influence the outcome. I disclosed the conflict and handed it off. That's what the job requires. A pause. I could hear Yvonne processing this, deciding whether to accept it or find a different angle. She says you could have helped her, Yvonne said, that you chose not to. I chose to follow the rules, I said. Same rules that apply to every applicant who walks through that door. Rochelle doesn't get different rules because she's my sister. That's cold, Aliyah. That is a cold thing to say about your own family. I took a breath. Did she tell you why the compliance department sent her a letter? Did she explain what was actually in her application that triggered the review? Silence. She said it was a technicality, Yvonne said finally. Something in me settled, flat and certain the way still water settles after you stop disturbing it. A technicality. That was the word Rochelle had chosen. $19,200 of actual income reported as $85,812 in assets reported as $40,000. $38,000 of credit card debt listed as none. A technicality. Okay, Mama, I said. I'll see you Sunday. I hung up. Curtis texted me 20 minutes later. 3 words. This is low. I read it at a red light. Set my phone face down on the passenger seat. Drove the rest of the way to work without looking at it again. Rochelle organized the family meeting herself. She called it within 72 hours of receiving the compliance letter, a gathering at the house on Westview Drive, framed to the family as an urgent conversation about something that had happened, something that needed to be addressed together as a family. She made calls, she sent texts, she contacted aunts and uncles and cousins, and 2 of our parents' closest family friends, people who had known us since we were children, people whose opinion of me had been quietly shaped by years of Rochelle's careful, consistent narration. 28 people confirmed. 28. She had constructed an audience. I found out about the meeting from Aunt Phyllis, who called me on Saturday morning with the particular directness she reserved for situations that required it. Rochelle's putting together a gathering at your parents' house tomorrow afternoon, she said. She's telling people she needs the family's support after what happened with the bank. She's planning to talk about you. I was standing in my kitchen, coffee in hand, looking out the window at the Midtown skyline. I took a slow sip. I know, I said, because I had expected it. Not the specific shape of it, not the 28 people, not the Sunday afternoon staging, but the impulse behind it. When Rochelle's narratives were challenged, she didn't retreat. She escalated. She gathered witnesses. She made the story bigger so that the weight of numbers would do what her credibility alone could no longer do. Are you going? Aunt Phyllis asked. I'm going, I said. A pause. What are you bringing? The truth, I said. Same thing I always bring. Wutn. I heard Aunt Phyllis exhale, not a sigh more, like the sound of someone setting something down they had been carrying for a long time. I'll be there, she said. Front row. I arrived at the house on Westview Drive at 2:58, 2 minutes before the time Rochelle had circulated. The driveway was full, cars lined both sides of the street. Through the front window, I could see people moving inside the particular density of a gathering that had been organized with purpose. I sat in my car for 60 seconds, not from hesitation, from intention. I wanted to walk in settled. I opened my laptop on the passenger seat. The document I had maintained for 8 years, dates, amounts, conversations, things said, and where and in front of whom was open to the last entry. Below it, I had added 3 new pages over the past week. Screenshots, account statements, the compliance department's initial findings summary that had been shared with me as the disclosing officer before my formal recusal. Public records, property deeds mine, all 3 of them pulled directly from the Fulton County Property Records database. I had not fabricated anything. I had not embellished anything. I had simply gathered what was already true and put it in one place. I closed the laptop, put it in my bag, walked to the front door. The room went quiet when I walked in. Not dramatically, not the way rooms go quiet in movies with a record scratch and every head turning in unison. It was subtler than that. A ripple. Conversations tapering off as people noticed me recalibrated looked between me and Rochelle, who was standing near the fireplace with a glass of water and an expression of grieved composure that she had clearly been rehearsing. Yvonne was seated on the sofa. Curtis stood near the hallway entrance with his arms crossed, not aggressive, just uncertain, the posture of a man who had agreed to host something he wasn't entirely sure about. Aunt Patricia was there, and Deshawn and Rochelle's friend Tamara, who had no business being at a family meeting, but whose presence I understood another witness, another body to fill the room with the weight of numbers. Aunt Phyllis was in the armchair by the window. She looked at me when I walked in. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just met my eyes with a steadiness that said, "I'm here." That was enough. Rochelle began speaking almost immediately, before I had fully taken my coat off, which I recognized as a tactical choice. She wanted the room's momentum before I had settled into it. "I appreciate everyone coming," she said. Her voice was controlled, careful, the register of someone performing composure for an audience. "I know it's short notice, but something happened this week that I think the family deserves to understand, because it affects all of us." A pause, perfectly timed. "My sister used her position at her bank to block my mortgage application. I submitted everything correctly, I did everything right, and because of her, I'm now being investigated by a compliance department for something I didn't do." The room was very still. I looked around at 28 faces, people I had known my whole life, people who had heard Rochelle's version of me for years, people whose expressions ranged from concerned to sympathetic to carefully neutral. I saw Aunt Patricia's jaw tighten slightly. I saw Deshawn looking at the floor. I saw Yvonne watching me with an expression I could not quite read. I set my bag down on the coffee table. I opened my laptop. "I'd like to respond," I said. My voice was calm, not cold calm. The difference mattered. Cold is defensive, calm is certain. "And I'd like to use documents so that nobody has to take my word for anything." Rochelle's composure shifted, just a fraction, a tightening around the eyes that she couldn't quite control. "Aaliyah, this isn't—" "I recused myself from your file," I said, looking directly at her. "The same morning I received it, before 10 o'clock. That is documented and time-stamped in the bank's system. I did not review your application. I did not influence the outcome. I did not make a single decision about your loan." I turned to the room. What I did do was disclose a conflict of interest, which is what the job requires. The compliance review was triggered by the application itself, not by me. By what was in it. I turned my laptop to face the room. "I'm going to show you 3 things," I said. First, what Rochelle reported on her application. Second, what her actual financial documents show. And third, I paused. Let the room sit with the pause for just a moment. Third, I'm going to show you my financial records, the ones she's been describing to this family for 8 years. The room was completely silent now. Rochelle set her water glass down on the mantelpiece. The sound of it glass on wood, sharp and small, in all that quiet, was the only sound in the room. "Because I think," I said, "it's time everyone in this family saw the truth, all of it." I walked them through it slowly. Not because I needed to. The documents were clear enough to speak for themselves. But I had spent 8 years being talked over in that family, talked around, talked about in rooms I wasn't in, and I was not going to rush this. I was going to let every person in that room sit with every number for as long as it took to land. First slide, Rochelle's application. Reported income $85,000. Reported assets $40,000. Reported debt 0. I let the room look at it. Second slide, Rochelle's actual tax returns. Actual income $19,200. Someone made a sound, not a word, just a sharp exhale. I didn't look up to see who. Third slide, Rochelle's bank statements. Actual combined savings at time of application, $812. The stillness in the room had changed texture. It was no longer the stillness of an audience waiting for a performance. It was the stillness of people absorbing something they could not immediately fit into the story they had arrived with. Fourth slide, the credit report summary. It $38,400 across 7 cards. 6 near maximum, 1 in collections. I heard Aunt Patricia say quietly, but not quietly enough, "Lord?" I closed that section without commentary. I did not editorialize. I did not say, "This is why the compliance department sent her a letter." I did not say, "This is what mortgage fraud looks like in a document." I let the numbers carry their own weight. They were more persuasive than anything I could have said about them. Then I opened the second section. "This," I said, "is me. My credit score 814. My annual income, salary, bonus, and rental income combined $162,000. My outstanding debt $0 on consumer credit. A mortgage balance on the East Point property of $61,000, well within standard debt-to-income parameters. Nothing else. My assets 3 properties, their current estimated values pulled directly from Fulton County public records. East Point $270,000. Reynoldstown duplex $340,000. College Park single family $195,000. Total portfolio value $805,000. I let that sit for a moment. $805,000. I watched 28 people do the math in real time. I watched the recalibration happen across the room in different ways, at different speeds, on different faces. Aunt Patricia had her hand pressed flat against her sternum. Deshawn was staring at the laptop screen with the expression of someone reading a document in a language they thought they knew but were suddenly unsure of. Two of my parents' friends, Miss Denora and her husband Jerome, who had been at every Fontaine gathering for 20 years, were looking at each other with the quiet private language of a couple processing the same thing simultaneously. Yvonne was looking at her hands. Curtis was looking at me. Rochelle broke first. "You did this to embarrass me," she said. Her voice had lost the rehearsed composure. What was underneath it was rawer. Not grief, not remorse, anger. The particular anger of someone who has been exposed and is reaching for a frame that makes them the victim of the exposure rather than the cause of it. "You brought all of this here in front of everyone to humiliate me." I looked at her. I took my time before I spoke. "I brought documents I said. "You brought 28 people." She opened her mouth, closed it. "You called this meeting," I said. "You organized it. You invited every person in this room specifically to hear your version of what happened at that bank. I walked in and offered a different version, with evidence." I paused. "That's not humiliation, Rochelle. That's a response." "She's right." Aunt Phyllis's voice came from the armchair by the window, unhurried, clear with the particular authority of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something and has decided, this is the moment. "You set this stage. You don't get to be surprised by what performs on it." Rochelle looked at Aunt Phyllis. Something moved across her face, the complicated expression of a person confronting someone they cannot dismiss. Aunt Phyllis was not an easy target. She never had been. Yvonne looked up from her hands. "We didn't know," she said. Her voice was different now, quieter, the practiced certainty gone out of it. What remained sounded closer to what it actually was. "Aaliyah, we didn't know any of this." "I know you didn't," I said, and I meant it without softness, without absolution, just the plain fact of it. "Because you didn't ask. You heard things about me, and you didn't ask. For years, you sat at tables where my name was attached to things that weren't true, and you didn't ask." I looked at my mother steadily. "There's a difference between not knowing and not looking. I need you to understand that." Yvonne absorbed that. She didn't argue it. Something in her face said she couldn't. Curtis uncrossed his arms. He looked older in that moment than I had ever seen him look. "We made assumptions," he said. The words came out with the heaviness of a man who had just understood something about himself that he did not like. "That wasn't right." It was the most honest thing my father had said to me in years. I nodded. I didn't thank him for it. It wasn't a gift. It was an acknowledgement of a debt. But I received it. The room began to shift after that. The 28 people Rochelle had assembled to witness her grievance rearranged themselves, some quietly collecting their coats, some gathered in low conversations, some simply sitting with the particular discomfort of people who have been made party to something they now wish they hadn't been. Rochelle stood by the fireplace for a moment longer, then she picked up her bag. "I'm going to need some time," she said. "To the room, up to no one specifically." She walked past me without making eye contact. I let her. I was not interested in a dramatic exit or a final word. I had said what needed to be said. The truth had been placed in a room full of witnesses, the same witnesses she had gathered to hear her version, and it could not be ungathered. Before I closed my laptop, I looked at the property deeds one more time. 3 addresses, 3 sets of coordinates on an Atlanta map that meant something to no one in that room except me and Aunt Phyllis, who had pointed me toward the first one. I closed the laptop, put it in my bag. Aunt Phyllis was standing beside me. "You did good," she said quietly. "I learned from you," I said. She squeezed my hand once, the same gesture she had used the summer I was 19, standing at a cookout, pressing a glass of lemonade into my hand and asking me if I could see what was happening. I could see it now. All of it. For the first time in my life, I walked out of that house without apologizing for existing, without making myself smaller at the door, without carrying anything that wasn't mine. The air outside was cold and clean. I breathed it in, and I drove home. 6 months have passed since that Sunday afternoon on Westview Drive. Atlanta is in full summer now, the kind of heat that arrives in June and settles in like it owns the place, heavy and certain, the air thick with humidity and the smell of cut grass and somebody's grill 2 blocks over. I'm sitting on the back porch of my East Point property on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, going through numbers for the Kirkwood duplex I closed on 11 days ago, my 4th property. The acquisition fund had been building for 2 years, waiting for the right listing. When it came, I moved quickly and cleanly and without anyone's permission. That's the thing nobody tells you about building in silence. After a while, the silence stops feeling like a secret. It starts feeling like freedom. The compliance review concluded 6 weeks after Rochelle's application was flagged. The findings were what the documents had always indicated: they would be material misrepresentation on income assets and existing debt. The bank's legal department evaluated the file and determined that the discrepancies, while serious, did not meet the threshold for federal prosecution as a first offense given the application had not been approved and no funds had been disbursed. Rochelle was not charged, but she was added to the bank's internal registry, a record that follows an applicant across the institution's network and is accessible to partner lenders through standard verification processes. In practical terms, her ability to obtain a conventional mortgage from any major lender in the next several years was effectively zero. The Buckhead Townhouse was gone. The lifestyle she had been constructing, one sponsored post and one maxed credit card at a time, had met the specific wall that all performances eventually meet. The audience had gone home. The stage was empty. What remained was the actual arithmetic of her life: $19,000 a year, $38,000 in debt, and an apartment her parents were quietly paying for while she figured out what came next. I did not feel triumphant about this. I want to be clear about that. There was no satisfaction in watching my sister navigate the consequences of choices she had made over years. The emotion I felt was something quieter and harder to name, closer to grief than vindication. Grief for the relationship we could have had if she had been a different person, or I had been a different person, or our family had built different patterns. Grief for all the Sunday dinners that had been something other than what they should have been. But I did not carry it as weight. I set it down at the door of my East Point house and left it on the porch. Curtis called me on a Tuesday evening in April. I almost didn't answer. Then I did. He was quiet for a moment after I picked up the long, particular silence of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and is still not entirely sure how to say it. Then he said, "I owe you an apology, a real one, not just for what happened at the meeting, for a long time before that." I sat down on my couch. "I believe things I should have questioned," he said. "I let your mother handle things I should have paid more attention to, and He stopped, started again. "You were always doing the right thing. I could see that. I just didn't say it enough. I didn't say it when it mattered." It was not a perfect apology. It did not address everything. It did not name Rochelle by name or acknowledge the specific texture of what had been allowed to happen for 12 years. But it was real. I could hear the realness of it, the uncomfortable, effortful quality of a man saying something that cost him something to say. "I hear you, Dad," I said. "Are we okay?" I thought about that for a moment. Honestly, not the answer I was supposed to give, not the answer that would make the conversation easier. The true one. "We're working toward it," I said. "That's real." He said that was enough. I believed him. We have spoken 4 times since then, each conversation a little less careful than the last. Something between us rebuilding slowly, imperfectly, without pretending the years before it didn't happen. I am not rushing it. Some things take the time they take. Yvonne and I are more complicated. She sent me a long text message in March, 2 paragraphs carefully worded, part acknowledgement and part explanation, and part the particular defensiveness of a mother who is not yet fully ready to look at what she enabled. I read it 3 times. I did not respond immediately. I gave myself 2 weeks to decide what I actually wanted to say rather than what would smooth things over fastest. When I did respond, I was honest. I told her I loved her. I told her that love had never been the question. I told her that what I needed from her, not as a performance, not as a text message, but as an actual shift in how she moved through our family, was to stop treating Rochelle's version of reality as the default, to ask before she assumed, to look before she accepted. She said she understood. I am waiting to see what understanding looks like in practice. I am not holding my breath. But I am leaving the door open because she is my mother and because Aunt Phyllis once told me that forgiveness and reconciliation are 2 different things, and you can do the first without committing to the second. I have forgiven her. Reconciliation is conditional, and the conditions are mine to set. Rochelle has not contacted me. I have not contacted her. I think about her sometimes, not with anger, not anymore. With the strange, distant clarity you have about people when you finally stop hoping they will become something they have shown you they are not. She is my sister. She will always be my sister, but she is not safe. And I have spent too many years arranging myself around people who were not safe and calling it loyalty. I know better now. Quentin moved in with me in May. He knows everything, not because I needed to confess it, but because he asked, and I have reached the age and the place in my life where I do not hide things from people who deserve the truth. He sat with me at the kitchen table one evening while I walked him through the whole story, from the Barnes and Noble gift card to the compliance letter to the Sunday afternoon on Westview Drive, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You carried that a long time. I did, I said. You don't have to anymore. I know that now. Fully in my bones, in the way you know things when you have lived them rather than just understood them intellectually. I am 31 years old. I own 4 properties in Atlanta. I have a career I built from nothing and a credit score that reflects every decision I made when no one was watching. I have Aunt Phyllis, who meets me for dinner at Piscal's twice a month and never lets me pay and always orders the catfish and always says exactly what needs to be said. I have a life I built myself, quietly, correctly, without asking anyone's permission and without waiting for anyone's acknowledgement. And I have learned finally completely without reservation that the people who couldn't see your value were never the ones qualified to determine it. If you've been the quiet one, the one building while others performed, the one keeping receipts while others kept audiences, I want you to hear this directly. Your silence was never weakness. It was strategy. And the truth always finds its desk eventually. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever had to let the truth speak for itself in a room full of people who had only heard the lie? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, check out the video in the description. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.